Okay, so a quick review for us here. Let me move this. Back down there. Keep flipping things around. All right, so we start with HTML, CSS. This is the basis of where we're going to build our applications. We're going to build something that can be served up from a server, and we're going to build something that is going to provide us with a bit of a framework to attach our application to. Eek. There we go. So, our application is typically a web document, something that is loaded from a server, downloaded into your local browser, where your browser interprets what's there and very, very quietly goes ahead and interprets all of the tags, turns them into an object in memory, and that is the document object. When it builds this document object, it's building a tree structure in terms of data structures. And that tree structure is comprised of a bunch of nodes, each node for a tag. The tags get various attributes attached to them. And the browser's entire job is to watch that document, and whenever something changes in it, it's going to update the screen. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit more because as we start talking frameworks, we're going to talk more and more about how the browser does this, because we're going to get involved with a little bit of how the frameworks can make things run a little bit faster, a little bit easier by manipulating how the documents are displayed. Every document, pardon me, starts with a doc type tag. That doc type tag tells us that this is an HTML5 document, and it tells the browser how to interpret what it finds there. Inside the doc type tag, which there's one of, yep, they're always recorded. Inside the doc type tag, there is a head section and a body section. The head section is for preloading things. The body section is for what we see. The preloaded things we typically load with link tags and script tags. The other tags that you will find inside the head, typically a title and or what we call meta tags. Now, meta tags are very special in that they're customized to each kind of browser and environment. They're also completely optional. So the specification says that meta tags can be completely ignored. However, most browsers pay attention to certain meta tags. And as we start to play around with more of the details of our HTML, we're going to introduce some of these meta tags and what they can do for us. Usually, they're related to things showing up on mobile devices and how do we specify how our HTML resizes itself automatically and dynamically for a mobile device. Inside the body tag, we're going to create a structure, and that structure is going to be a collection of nested tags. Every tag has a specific use and purpose. It gets interpreted by the browser a specific way. Those tags can have attributes. Attributes are placed inside the opening part of the tag. Those interesting opening tags and their attributes form HTML. The attributes that are there come in two flavors. Those attributes are attributes that are common to all tags, and there's attributes that are specific to specific tags. There's a collection of tags I've shown in the slide here where we're using specific tags to make it easier for humans to read the structure of our document. But so far, we haven't done a whole lot with the HTML. We build it once. We build this one really huge single page of HTML, which is where the term single page application comes from. And once we build that single page, we let the browser interpret it, draw it on the screen, and we're going to use JavaScript to manipulate it. Now, in order to get this to look decent, we're going to need something that manages the look and feel. And that's where we get to the second part of our HTML, CSS, HTML5 applications. The concept that has been pervasive in almost all software development is that you should build your software in self-contained units that are completely decoupled from other parts of your system. And that does two things. One, it makes it easier to find stuff. And two, it makes it easier to manage, maintain, and move parts to other new applications. So this is all gearing up to how do you build applications that become increasingly large and get to the point where no one person can keep the whole thing in their head. So you have to break it out into a bunch of smaller applications and link them together. The term is called separation of concerns. And the idea here is that the HTML part separates out the structural framework of our application from the rest of the concerns that we're going to deal with, namely look and feel and functionality. CSS is where we deal with look and feel. Now, when we're building CSS, we're building additional types of information to attach to that document object. These parts of information are almost always loaded from an external or a separate file. That file contains a collection of selectors, and you can think of those as queries or filters on the document object that's there. Those filters specify which nodes in the document hierarchy that they should apply to. And then the styles listed inside there, the attribute : value pairs for CSS, are then attached to each node in the DOM, or in the document object. When we attach those things, the browser can then use them to figure out how to make certain things look, what color to make them, what font to use, what kind of spacing around them, all of the kind of attributes that help us value the parts we're doing. So when we're talking CSS, we're talking the specific kinds of styles that we want to attach given a given selector. The things we're interested in, selectors are the filters or the search mechanism by which we go through the DOM to figure out what applies. And styles are the specific look and feel elements we want to attach to our HTML document. Those selectors come in three main flavors, one of which we're going to use sparingly, one of which we're going to try not to use at all. The other one we're going to lean on heavily. Those three are listed up above here. The first one is the tag-based styles. So that's where an element or a tag name is used to define the selector for a style. Those tags apply to all tags of that specific type. So if it's a div or a section or an unordered list, all of the styles that are attached to that tag selector get applied to all elements of that style. It's great for setting a baseline, and it's sometimes used to help us zero out or clear out all of our styles so that we get a consistent look. But beyond that, we're not going to use them a ton. The next one down in my list here is a class selector, and the class selector is the one that we're going to lean on the most heavily. We're going to use the class attribute in our HTML to identify a string as a value for that class attribute. And the string is going to list all of the class selector names that apply to that particular element. All of the styles are compiled together, and this is where the cascade part comes from. If you load styles from multiple style sheets or from multiple style tags, the selectors dictate which things they apply to, the cascade is in the order they're loaded, they're attached to that document object model in memory. Which means if 3 people use the same style, then the last guy in wins. That's the key to making sure your styles look right. Debugging some of the styles can be challenging at times because you have to trace through where the styles are coming from. The last one, the ID selector there, is used when we attach specific styles to a specific element in our document. And attaching a specific style to a specific element is something, in the most part, we want to avoid doing in our CSS. Pardon me. In our CSS, we're trying to do things in the most repeatable, generic way possible. So anytime we have to attach styles to a specific ID or a specific element, we're really acknowledging that this one particular element is going to be treated very, very differently. And perhaps what we should be doing is creating a new kind of class for that element in case we need to add another one in the future. For the values that we have, we're going to have to add specific styles, and the better references for both the HTML tags and the CSS styles are in the W3 Schools lists of all the available tags and styles. The best way to start us off doing this is to actually build a little bit. So I'm going to fire up Visual Studio Code, and we're going to build a little review app. I'm going to try and include almost everything that we've done before. And we're going to try and put that into our application and see if we can't take a look at something. So let's flip over to that guy. Here's our Visual Studio Code. I've got a folder for this particular class. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a folder to put each application in. Now, the reason I usually like to do this is because I'm a little bit on the lazy side, and I kind of want to have one place that I tell my web server to go serve files from. And because it can serve files from any subfolder underneath that, I only have to set it up and configure it once on my local development environment. In this case, I've got one folder here that I can link into, and so every different application that I build will be its own separate folder. So here's my review folder. Inside the review folder, we're going to start from the very start, and that's index.html. Now, we name it index.html for historical reasons, but also because it's the main index of all the other things in this folder, in this location. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that the index.html file is usually pre-linked or pre-built into most web servers, whether they're Nginx or Node or Apache, it doesn't really matter. They all want to do one thing, and that is serve files out to a browser. And if you can set up the configuration so that you don't have to type index.html all the time, but you actually can just drop in a folder name into your browser, that's going to be much easier for a user to use at the end of the day. So always, 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 the main file in your main folder for your application is index.html, no exceptions. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to edit our main file. And in there, what we're going to do is we're going to build some basic HTML. So, like I said, the first tag is always the doc type. Now, there's no close for this. It's just doc type. This is what signifies to the browser that it's going to be an HTML5 thing, and there's nothing that comes before it, not even a comment, and there's no close to it. There are other specifications for this guy if you want to use an HTML4 or earlier version of HTML. But we're talking about stuff that's easily a decade old now. So what we often do is just stick with the straightforward. Everybody supports HTML5 now. It's all good. Inside, we've got a head and a body. Now, those guys get wrapped in an HTML tag. Slice those together so I don't forget anything. The head tag is where we're going to put all the stuff we don't see, all the stuff we need to preload. So we can put a title in. That's the title in the tab bar. We can put meta tags in. Those usually are self-closing. We can put links in, self-closing as well. We can put script tags in. And finally, we can put style tags in. Now, each of these has a different use in the head section. Script tags, which is the most interesting part to us for the most part, are JavaScript components. So I usually like to load them last. And script tags can go in either the head or the body. So I usually like to load my code last, and up here I like to load any libraries that we're going to use. Here we're going to put local testing styles. Put this one on the end. Here's our miscellaneous stuff. I'm really not doing good with the typing. All right. Now, these guys didn't come out exactly right because they're expecting a certain kind of content inside there. There we go. And my dyslexia. All right. Now, in order to build anything with the web, we're going to need some kind of basic, simple structure just to be able to hang some stuff off of. We're usually building what we call single-page applications, so I typically think of this as multiple screens potentially, but all in one HTML file. So when we talk about single page, we're talking about single HTML file. We're not talking about just one screen. So I can build a section. Sometimes I'll put an ID on it, and this is just for my reference. And give it a name. Convention-wise, the values that we use for IDs and classes are always kebab case, because we don't have any case sensitivity in our HTML. I can put containers inside here, and inside there I can create various different elements. And in this case, I'm going to style it. I'm using a span to make it an inline thing I'm going to style. And then we can put some content in. And maybe I want to add, let me stretch this out a little bit for you. And maybe I want to add something a little fancier with some list items. Let's use these quotes. And finally, just because, you know, you always got to have some chocolate in there. Makes everything better. Maybe I've got some other HTML in here. And other things I'm not quite sure of. And the last thing we're going to put in here is our script. We want to make it very clear what kind of script we have loaded here. And this we're going to use a module as the type of script we're going to use. Now the module type for our JavaScript tells us that we're going to use the latest, greatest ECMA script module system for importing and exporting components. This is going to help us keep our code nice and small and modular and reusable and reconfigurable. So I'm going to start with a matching index.js file. And the reason I'm going to call it index.js is twofold. It's changed even in my mind over the years. Index.js makes it pretty clear that it goes hand in hand with index.html. Index.js is the de facto standard that node type applications typically want. And so all of us typically follow those naming conventions so that any one programmer can jump into a team of other programmers and know what's working and what's not pretty quickly. Now, that's everything that needs to go in an HTML file. The number of sections you have, or the number of screens you might have, is all up to what your application needs to do. But this is the bare minimum. You need something in there. I typically use sections to break out separate pages. When we're building applications, we often have multiple different screens or dialog boxes or pages, and it can get quite confusing inside one big, long HTML file. A couple other conventions that are in here. I've told you about the kebab case for names. The second thing is, I don't know if you figured out, but I don't have anything linked in yet. I don't have any CSS linked in. I don't have any external files written. There's no index.js. All of that goes into separate files later. So I typically start with the structure with the HTML. I also like to build my HTML out before I've built the CSS, so I can just name things whatever I want to name them. Another key part is the indentation. Yeah, I have some tools working in my editor to help me open and close tags, making sure everything is lined up nicely. But the indentation is there visually for me so that I can see that this unordered list and this closing of the unordered list are lined up with each other so they're matched with each other. And we want that so that when we start doing big applications, we don't get confused in which thing closes which other thing. The indentation helps us keep that straight visually. Okay, that's our HTML part. Now, to do the CSS part, we're going to need to link in something else. We're going to need to link in some styles. We can put those here in our local testing styles, just like we can put some JavaScript here as well. That's not going to work. And our styles come in a number of different flavors. First of all, we can attach something to a specific tag. Every style has a selector. This is the selector right here. That means that this style is going to apply to everything that is of the same tag. And this is where we're going to put our style in here. Now, my latest favorites, I like to use these guys. For the most part, in order to keep things responsive, that means they will change dynamically based on the size of the browser on your screen. We typically will stick with percentage-wise type units. It just scales nicer, and unless it's really critical, like a game editor, a specific screen resolution, it's much, much safer. However, you've probably noticed that percentages scale weird, and it's because they scale relative to their parents. Whereas the VWVH units, which are the virtual width and virtual height, are percentage of the current screen width and screen height. They just work a little bit smoother. And in fact, if you get used to using things like min width and min height, you will get a much better result in terms of having your screen elements show up the size you want them. The next thing I can put in here, I can put in class type elements. Now, the worst thing I've got here is I've got the word class in the name of my class. Well, the way it's defined, this selector is a class. So putting the word class in here is redundant. It's just doing the same thing twice. And we want to avoid doing the same thing twice wherever possible. And we also want to avoid typing. So typically we would not put this in there. Just for demo purposes, it's easier to see it. Finally, we can attach styles with ID selectors. And those styles with ID selectors can use different units. And those will apply to just one specific thing. And as you can imagine, that's going to be a little bit of a challenge, because if I want to add list items, I'm not going to have a nice style for them. They're just going to be, one of them has got a certain line height and the rest of them are manually having to be manipulated. Okay, now that we've got some HTML and a little bit of CSS, we could also talk about how we link in external files. And the way we put external files together is really just an extension of this link attribute. Now, with links, we got to give it the kind of thing it is. So a style sheet is a file that contains a whole bunch of selectors and styles. And then, just because, who would want to be consistent, we can throw it in our style.css file. Now, we haven't built that style.css file yet, so that's going to be a little bit of a challenge for us as we go. Now, I talked about meta tags as well, and there's a number of meta tags that we can attach to our application. I'm going to throw a couple in here now, and these are fairly common ones you should run into. The name attribute on a meta tag is the name of this meta tag. and it's something the browser can go search for. These are usually things that are specific to specific browsers. So Chrome is going to look for specific things, Safari looks for specific things, Firefox looks for specific things, who knows what Opera looks for. All of those different attributes that are listed here are all optional attributes, and the browser can choose to do its own thing with them or ignore them completely. Most of the meta tags that I'm going to show you here are ones that all the browsers support in the same way anyways. So the description goes into the tooltip that pops up when you put your mouse over the browser tab. And most of the browsers do it the same way. I can add more meta tags. In fact, there's no limit to the number I can do. One of the most common ones is the viewport. And the content for that has a huge variety of ways that you can specify it. The content in the viewport tells the browser the constraints on the dimensions of the viewport. So, for instance, this particular one tells us that the browser width by default is the size of the device width. So when we're loading this up on a mobile device, it tries to make the browser width the full width of the device. We can also specify things like scale. So the scale attribute in there in the viewport tells us the initial scaling on fonts to use when this is loaded in the browser. Again, this is another one that's set up for mobile devices because when we load on a mobile device, as you're now aware with some of the Android stuff you've done, the scale factor on the fonts is not the same as the actual screen resolution. Typically, our screen resolution that's reported by our Android or iOS device is quite a bit smaller, a multiple smaller than the actual screen resolution. And that's done so that fonts come out looking right, and so you don't have to squint your eyes and kill them to see micro fonts. When we're putting different web applications together and we know they're going to be available on a mobile device, we probably want to put in the viewport meta tag. We can add more meta tags, but you can look up what some of the other different configurations are. It's not important what they are right now. Okay, let's talk CSS. Let's move the CSS over into its proper location. So inside Review, I'm going to create a new folder called CSS. And this is where I'm going to put my cascading style sheets. I've named the first one style.css. And we get a new file. Comments in here. Anyone else have problems writing their own name? And here we can load in any classes that we might have used in here, like another class or some styles. Just some simple stuff in there. One of the things I do like to do here, there are all sorts of crazy kind of style selectors you can put together. And we can get into a lot of the details of them. Here's a couple things. You can attach stuff to everything. Now, this is a really dangerous selector because it applies to everything. But sometimes when you want to do things like zeroing out all the margins and paddings, you might want to do it globally. If you want to attach it to multiple selectors simultaneously, you can separate them with a comma. You don't have to write them all as individual things. So maybe I do the HTML body and everything with margins and padding. Standard CSS also has some interesting things we can do, like, for instance, we can specify variables. And in this case, let's say I make it gray because I like my white, gray, black thing because it's particularly ugly. And in some styles here, I can list the background color to be a variable. Now, if I want to change the color, I can change it in one spot, and everywhere I've used this variable background color, it will get changed dynamically. All right. Okay, I'm going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to do the same kind of stuff with some JavaScript. And after we've done some stuff with the JavaScript, then we're going to take a look at some architectural stuff and how we're going to apply it to the next cool game we're going to build.